fact, I am the lead speaker on behalf of the opposition, perhaps for the last time on this bill today, as the Honourable Dennis Hood is our Shadow Minister for Training in the other House, and I'm very grateful to Dennis for the work he has done to understand this bill, its intentions, its motivations, to consult with stakeholders on behalf of the Liberal Party, to consider the implications of these measures, what they'll mean for our industries and our training sector and the TAFE organisation, and come forward with our position, which I'm happy to set out on his behalf in this chamber. And I say, therefore, at the outset, the Liberal Party is inclined to support this bill. Although the Shadow Minister for Training, as I said, the Honourable Dennis Hood MLC, will be putting forward some amendments on behalf of the Liberal Party in the Upper House that will, if accepted, improve the legislation. I will explain those amendments for the benefit of the Minister, advisers and those on the government side who might have the opportunity to consider them, therefore between the Houses we will share those with the government or table them in the Legislative Council, and I hope that the government will consider them with an open mind. We're inclined to support this bill, not potentially because it is perfect legislation, after all what is, but because we have formed a view that it is a clear improvement on the status quo. That is our party's view. As a former minister with responsibility at the time for the TAFE SA organisation, that is also my view. The reforms in this bill are not the only options available to the Parliament that would improve this Act, but it is my view that, when the approach the government has taken is as a result of the review that they commissioned upon coming to government, it's my view that it would be folly when dealing with an Act of this nature, the foundational legislation for our state's public training provider, to attempt to implement ideas from the opposition benches without the resources of government. So we work with the government, we seek to be a constructive opposition, we judge the bill on its merits as being better than the status quo, and we will offer improvements as appropriate. So I'll spend a little time considering why we view the bill as useful in the context. So as you would recall, we were both here, the current TAFE Act was designed at a time when it was assumed that there would be a fully contestable training market within which TAFE SA would operate as the government business to ensure that gaps within the training market were being filled. That was the plan, and to be clear, this wasn't some sort of libertarian bureaucracy bashing endeavour of the Liberal Party. This was the considered policy opinion of the Labor government at the time and the federal Labor government at the time, led by Julia Gillard, that was pushing the state Labor government at the time in this direction. I remind members of the stream of Labor ministers for training during that 16-year stretch: Jane Lomax-Smith, Steph Key, Paul Kiker, Michael O'Brien, Jack Snelling, Tom Kenyon, Grace Portalesi, Gail Gago, and the now member for Port Adelaide at the end. The member for Wright can probably take some pride in the fact that I believe he is now set, if he holds on for another 5 months, to be the first Labor training minister or minister responsible for TAFE to have held on to that for a full term since Lynn Arnold 40 years ago. A point, no doubt, that his office can take with some level of pride, and I hope they put something on their wall. At any rate, the minister at the time, Tom Kenyon, in introducing the bill in April 2012, highlighted also the strong push towards this model as a result of national ministerial discussions championed and pushed under the Prime Ministership of Julia Gillard. In introducing that bill in April 2012, Minister Kenyon, as was then, Labor Minister as was then, highlighted three particular outcomes achieved by introducing a statutory corporation model for TAFE SA. And I'll take a moment to quote them. I note that Associate Professor Ray also quoted some of these in her report. And in retrospect, I wish I'd reread her report prior to rereading this Hansard. It might have saved me the trouble of finding it. But nevertheless, he said in 2012, firstly, by establishing TAFE SA as a statutory corporation, TAFE SA will be provided with greater commercial autonomy and accountability through a board of directors and flexibility and independence from government processes. This will enable TAFE SA to be even more responsive to market needs. identify in commentary that I am not sure that anyone would suggest it has fulfilled that ambition. Secondly, Minister Kenyon said, by establishing TAFE SA as a statutory corporation, greater separation of the roles of TAFE SA and the Department of Further Education, Employment, Science and Technology, DFEAST, will be achieved. This is important in the development of the demand-driven and market-based model introduced by Skills for All to ensure that the relationship between the funder and the provider of the training is transparent for all participants of the training system. And 2 to 3 years later, that ambition was rendered completely unfulfilled, as indeed the opposite took place, as TAFE's needs subsumed 90% of the training budget after the Skills for All debacle was concluded. And indeed the intention there was only rectified in 2018 when TAFE SA was removed entirely from the Skills Department. You had different ministers and different departments responsible for supporting the training sector, and TAFE SA as a participant within that sector. I was responsible as Minister for Education for TAFE SA. Minister Personi, the member for Unley, was responsible for the training sector. And during that time, we were able to fulfil the ambitions of the training sector and the government's ambitions for the training sector by having a minister dedicated to that, and separately TAFE SA organised by a minister who was focused on fixing its quality issues and supporting the organisation to recover from the situation it was in, and then be a participant able to operate effectively within the training sector. I highlight that briefly as a diversion. It's certainly not considered a problem by me or the Liberal Party that the TAFE is now back within the training portfolio necessarily. From a structural point of view, there are significant obvious complementarities. But there were a lot of things that had to be done between 2018 and 2022 to enable that to operate without the risk of returning to a system where TAFE subsumed the training budget to the detriment of the rest of the sector. TAFE's budget having been fixed prior to 2022, we're now in a situation where it has been able to be more closely integrated. The third thing that Minister Kenyon, as was then highlighted as an opportunity created by the bill at the time. He said, thirdly, by establishing TAFE SA as a statutory corporation, the state will meet an important requirement of the Commonwealth Government's reform of the VET system. The proposed governance changes for TAFE SA satisfy the Commonwealth's national skills reform agenda. The direct implication is that VET fee help, income contingent loans, will be available to VET students from South Australia who study at least diploma level, where study is publicly subsidised through approved training providers. And of course, we've been through about 3, well, possibly 6 or 7, depending on how you count, different federal funding models since then. So that third ambition is no longer relevant. So, in short, it didn't work out. And the Skills for All framework, upon which the whole body of reform depended, collapsed upon itself spectacularly. 5 years' worth of funding was used up in about 2 years. And all of a sudden, the market that had grown so quickly was left without any oxygen, was left without any money. TAFE SA has never been able to support itself as a market player in a level playing field with other non-government providers. There's never been really such a playing field. But unlike those other providers, never having had their status as public servants amended, the TAFE SA staff benefited from entitlements and job protections, not incorrectly because that was the job that they had signed up to, but they were, to say the least, a lot more generous than anyone in the non-government sector. It was impossible for non-government providers, in many cases, to retain staff when TAFE SA was advertising the same job at potentially 30% more pay with 29 non-contact days on top of leave and 1 year's guaranteed opportunity to look for a new job if they were found to be redundant, with a significant loading of about 30 or 40% if they were HPIs. There's a series of benefits that made it appealing for staff to try and work for TAFE SA rather than the non-government sector. And then on top of that, at the time, I think this was about 2014, 2015, the direction of funding to TAFE SA at the exclusion of the non-government sector led to 90% of the training budget going specifically to TAFE SA. Because TAFE SA was underwritten by government, the government of the day, under then Minister Gago, responded to the industrial obligations of those staff, as I said, by channeling 90% of the training budget into the TAFE SA organisation specifically, enabling it to pay its bills, but it left the private and not-for-profit sector utterly suffocated. Many RTOs, not-for-profit and private providers alike, providers of significant reputation and quality, including household names like the Master Builders Association, who I think every member of this House respects for the work that they do, were forced to close the doors of their RTOs for good. Trainers moved elsewhere and got other jobs. The depth in the market diminished. The credibility of the sector plummeted, as did in training numbers, especially apprenticeships, traineeships, and the distortions in the Vet for Schools situation was highlighted by the fact that large numbers of people were doing vet programs in high school, counting towards the numbers, a significant proportion of numbers at that point, but not actually completing them to the point of being able to get a parchment, but just fulfilling the requirements of their Year 12 program, thus using up their entitlement to a training subsidy, which meant that if those students then, having completed Year 12, wanted a subsidised program, they had used up their entitlement. Extraordinary waste within this system, to the detriment of the sector, to the detriment of the students who were to benefit from it. Many people still hoped during this time that it might be at some stage possible to return to a contestable training market, including then Labor ministers, right up until about 2017, when the government of the day decided this was to be an election point of difference that they hoped might save them some votes ahead of the 2018 election. But look, I'll be frank, and this became increasingly apparent to me during my time as the minister, the distortions and disruptions in the market and the impacts of some of those debacles, 2015, Skills for All, 2017, the quality crisis and others, really made this ambition pretty much impossible. TAFE's unique industrial obligations, along with its obligations to serve the state's needs by offering services where non-government providers couldn't sustain themselves, along with the still significant historical cost challenges, have meant that it has pretty much always had to be supported with preferential funding compared to non-government providers. A ratio of as high as $4 to $1 has been described to me per training hour. I think 3 to 1 is more common. I'm not sure what it is now exactly, but it is certainly the same training is much more expensive at TAFE from a government subsidy point of view than it is at a non-government provider. The question for me has always been, is the quality there, and how can we ensure that the most number of students possible, the most number of businesses that need their skills met as possible, are able to have quality service provision of their training needs as we can get for the government dollar. At any rate, I don't want to get into a political argument about why this is the case or what should be done about it. I just make the point that as we consider this bill, we are well and truly past the point where anyone can pretend that the contestable policy ambitions of state and federal Labor governments in 2012, which led to our current legislative framework, have any foundation in reality. The current Act was designed to serve as an environment for training operators that was subsequently destroyed over the next 5 years. And to be clear, this is actually pretty common ground between us all. I might express it slightly differently, but I've restated things that have been admitted by current ministers. The Minister for Education would probably have different emphases. He'd probably view more kindly the tenures of at least some, maybe not all, of his Labor and formerly Labor predecessors. But in 2023, I think I have it here, the Minister announced in one of the advertisers' splash and spreads with Andrew Huff in August 6, 2023, that Labor had got it wrong and reforms would be introduced to turn TAFE from a statutory authority into a statutory authority from a corporation chasing profits. And I quote from the article, in a rare public admission of Labor failures, Training and Skills Minister Blair Boyer will on Monday admit the state government wrongly corporatised the embattled agency in 2012 to chase profits. Now, I made the point at the time to the esteemed journalist, my constituent, Andrew Huff, that in 11 years of corporatisation, TAFE SA had never actually turned a profit, no matter how it was chasing them, but nevertheless, in relation to serving the state's needs, the annual charter provided to TAFE SA by the Minister and Treasurer set out their requirements for the organisation as the government's public provider of VET, and its role in assisting the government in meeting its strategic objectives for technical and further education. The Charter sets out the nature and scope of commercial and non-commercial services, and meanwhile it has a performance statement as well, which sets out targets for the corporation to pursue, including training activity, load pass rate, qualification completion ratio, employment outcomes and student satisfaction. However, I think this gets to the Minister's point in moving this bill. Absent specific instruction in the Charter or the performance statement or other appropriate direction from Government or the Minister or the Treasurer, or in the case of when the department is split with the training sector being under a separate authority, the purchasing minister's requirement of the TAFE SA organisation as a provider, the strategic considerations of the board are legally required to act in accordance with the Corporations Act and therefore in the best interests of TAFE SA as an organisation, and that can of course from time to time be defined differently to the state's best interests. I think that is the basis of the Minister's intention today is really to remove those obligations of the Corporations Act from the board's consideration so it can focus instead on the objectives set out by the government and the Minister of the day and the functions ascribed within the Act. We will support the bill. That said, as the current Minister has done over the last 3 years, and certainly when I was the Minister, we worked within the framework that exists, supported by some outstanding public servants, an extremely motivated and high-functioning board, to deliver necessary reforms to set TAFE's budget on a sustainable footing and to ensure that quality was front and centre. I'll come to the critical importance of that work, but suffice to say, it is possible to work within the framework of the current Act. While the Act has had its issues, and we are supporting the reforms, I think I've said that a few times, so leave anyone in no doubt, the truth is that there were several issues that had a much, much bigger impact, created much larger problems for TAFE than the responsibilities imposed on the board by the reflections of the Corporations Act. The findings of the Nous review into quality at TAFE, tabled in this Parliament in 2018, along with the Moran-Banikoff review into TAFE's strategic capabilities, tabled at the same time, were truly damning when it came to the governance of the organisation during this period being in particular the years leading up to 2017 and the failings under the ASQA audit. Those reports were commissioned by the member for Port Adelaide when she was the Minister. They were published during my time as the Minister, tabled in this House and then published, to be clear. I'll come to them later, but I just highlight that many of my reflections to come were not necessarily just those of a shadow minister as I was from 2016 to 2018, looking for chinks in the armour of the government or complaints to make about the Labor Party at the time. They were in fact based on the reflections of the Moran-Banikoff review, the Nous review, and also the advice of senior officers of the Public Service of South Australia, including within TAFE, all of whom were appointed under the term of the Weatherall Labor government. Just as big a factor then as the issues with the Act, at a time when the Marshall Liberal government was elected in 2018 and I received my briefings as an incoming minister, was the discovery of the cynical manner in which successive Labor government treasurers had treated the TAFE board as an uncomplaining source of budget fixes for those Treasury problems. Blunt cuts and efficiencies, fanciful revenue projections that could never have hoped to have been achieved were baked into the budget papers year upon year to the benefit of the Treasurer's forward projections, but to the detriment of the TAFE SA organisation, the training sector in South Australia, the businesses and the industries that needed skilled workforce, and the students and young people who wanted to be upskilled, and the mature workers who wanted to be upskilled, who should have been able to benefit from a more effective, more streamlined, higher quality training sector TAFE organisation as well. So when I was appointed minister, I was frankly absolutely stunned to learn of the scale of the former government's budget decisions that were never communicated to the public prior to the 2018 election. They were imposed on TAFE SA's budget by Treasury and never highlighted or identified to the public by the TAFE board, the minister, or indeed the government. Successive sets of efficiency dividends and cuts, including 3 years' worth of savings that weren't achieved from previous years but were then rephased into the 2018 to 2021 period by the member for West Torrens's 2017 mid-year budget review, and his own new efficiency dividend imposed at the same time, added to a total of $97 million in budget cuts to the TAFE SA organisation across the forward estimates that had not, as I say, been articulated to the public once prior to the 2018 election, to my knowledge. That included $6 million for the 2017-18 year, which had been blown out of the water by industrial rulings. The AEU, when the skills crisis took place in September to December 2017, the AEU took TAFE to the SAET to seek a cancellation or a postponement of a structural reform TAFE was trying to do at the time to reduce the amount of work they were doing in low activity and low public value course offerings. The industrial rulings by the SAET were in the AEU's favour, and therefore the $6 million that the Labor government had been trying to save at the time through cancelling those courses was not able to be achieved as a result of the SAET's rulings, and so those $6 million of savings remained into the budget. The savings and cuts baked into the budget which TAFE were expected to deliver weren't $6 million a year, however. That was the low year in 2017-18. They were to grow every year until in the 2020-2021 year, under the settings left by the Treasurers, successive Treasurers, if they'd had their way from the former Weatherill Labor government, would have grown as high as $30.5 million per year. Even the best board in the world would have been up against it to deliver in those circumstances. Now, I'm not going to dwell on the question of how well that board was performing. More than enough has been said over the years, I feel, other than to highlight the historical fact that the member for Port Adelaide publicly withdrew her confidence, and on Cabinet's recommendation, the Governor fired the chair of the board late in 2017, the chief executive already having resigned. Look, I stand to be corrected, but I can't recall that happening in any other circumstance that comes to mind, certainly not in an organisation of this significance to the state. So, I don't want to diminish in any way the value of the bill that we're considering today, which we're supporting and I think does have some value. I think it will improve the organisation. The point I make is that in 2017 and 2018, as the dedicated and passionate staff at TAFE, as their leaders, as the board members, the one ongoing one and the new ones who came in, as the public servants and other agencies who were supporting them, as the incoming government from March 2018 onwards, all worked very hard to give TAFE SA a fresh start and to give our training sector a sustainable future in which it would thrive and provide the services to businesses, industries and students that we all need it to. The imperfections of the the TAFE SA Act wouldn't have made it into the top 10 considerations that were keeping people up at night. I'm not saying that the imperfections weren't felt, and I'm not saying that this isn't worthy work. I'm just highlighting that there were a number of other pieces of work that had to be done first. It was an enormous body of work just to identify the true cost of any individual service delivery within the TAFE organisation and the basis in which it was operating. It was an enormous body of work to work out how to remediate the challenges that were created and to build up the quality and the reputation at TAFE. There are many excellent public servants and TAFE staff and board members who worked countless hours that I doubt will ever be fully appreciated or understood by people in this state other than those staff members and their long-suffering families. I'm very grateful to them all. I want to put on my record my thanks to them all. I'll name a few, but there are countless others who I should name, and this speech has already gone on for coming up half an hour, so I don't have time for them all, but I will identify a few. And so did the board chairs during that time. Rick Pearce, for the first 6 months. I suspect of his many achievements within the public service. Being requested to be the interim chair of the TAFE board for a period of time hadn't been on his bucket list, but I'm sure he's now grateful to have had that experience. Jackie McGill and then Joe Denley. I highlight Joe Denley had in fact been installed by the member for Port Adelaide as the chair of the TAFE board after the firing of the previous chair by the Governor. And Joe Denley was the acting chair coming in. She served on the interim TAFE board under Rick Pearce, along with some senior public servants of great merit, who I'm grateful to, and Jo Denley continued on the TAFE board under the appointment of Jackie McGill. And when Jackie McGill, having served 2 years, indicated she wished to go to focus her energy on, I think Jo Denley stepped up again. Jo Denley was last year recognised at the State South Australian Training Awards for her lifetime of service to the sector. I probably mentioned it then. I hope I sent her an SMS, but I mark for the record now my significant gratitude, as I know the Minister and the former Minister equally have incredibly high regard for the work she did. Interim TAFE Chief Executive Alex Reid, thrust into the situation at an extraordinarily difficult time. I really valued her extraordinary professionalism as the incoming Chief Executive, as I was the incoming Minister, and there was a lot of important work that happened during her term. Also, the acting TAFE Chief Executive, Julianne Rietstra, former Deputy Chief Executive of the Education Department and about to retire Chair of Zoos SA, whose service to South Australia was extended through this body's work as well, and particularly David Coltman, whose service as the Chief Executive of TAFE has only just recently concluded, and as the current Minister has already done, we thank him for his service too, his significant work in this body, in this area. As I say, there are dozens of others who I could and probably should name, but I will only single out one more, being Chris Bernardi, whose body of work supporting TAFE CFOs in particular, in addition to his day job at the Education Department, which was not insignificant, was instrumental in developing the case that convinced Cabinet, including Treasurer Rob Lucas, of the need to correct the fantasy budget figures that had had such a negative impact on the TAFE organisation and our training sector for so long. Ultimately, over 4 years, without cannibalising the rest of the training budget, indeed while investing hundreds of millions of dollars of new money into expanded programs for apprenticeships, traineeships, vocational education in schools, non-government providers, both not-for-profits and private providers of quality, in addition to all of that, the former Liberal government injected more than $350 million over the course of its 4 budgets into the TAFE SA organisation. That was a combination of new money, reductions in the previous Labor government's identified cuts, and more favourable, well actually not more favourable, just realistic assumptions related to revenue. The abolition of the previous Weatherall Labor government's Fantasyland revenue projections, which made the TAFE board and the TAFE organisation's job pretty much impossible. So I'm really not given to hyperbole, but the rescue of the TAFE SA organisation from the brink of disaster that it was on from 2018 to 2022 will stand as one of the significant achievements of the Marshall Liberal government, and it was left in a sustainable position by the time of the 2022 election with realistic budget figures. And the fact that the TAFE SA organisation, its budget overspends since the 2022 election have been rounding errors effectively, compared to regularly being tens of millions of dollars every single year prior, is testament to the budget fixes that were put in place prior to that 2022 election. There's been new money as well, but that new money has paid for different things. The underlying assumptions that TAFE SA's budget is now based on are now realistic. We've actually copped some criticism since the election for having a disproportionate amount of new money during the term of the Marshall Liberal government go into the TAFE SA organisation rather than non-government and private providers, which is ironic because we've also had criticism from the AEU at the same time that we were providing too much money to the non-government providers. The truth is, sir, that the Marshall Liberal government significantly increased funding to both. The market, we provided a curated market where higher levels of opportunity were there for areas to be supported by private providers where there was quality and depth in the market. And indeed, we also provided massive injections of funding to enable TAFE SA to be the quality organisation that all South Australians deserve and all of its staff aspired to be. It's really important to note, when we look at the Nous review into quality and the Moran-Banachov review into TAFE strategic capabilities and all of the other advice I got, none of those documents criticised the vast majority of TAFE staff who work their guts out to support training in their sectors. There are problems about the structure of the training sector. the extraordinary difficulties that structure provides for non-government providers. There are criticisms of governance, of oversight, of Treasury decisions, and of strategic intent. And we'll go through some of them a bit later. But the staff at TAFE, many of whom have worked very hard for a very long time, are to be commended, particularly those who worked so hard to set TAFE on their trajectory towards being able to thrive in the years ahead from what were very difficult times in 2017 for many of them. Anyway, we left TAFE in a sustainable position. The new government was elected in 2022. They came in with their own policy agenda, including some new programs they prefer to some of those that were in place. They have adjustments in the settings to prioritise investment in TAFE SA specifically, rather than allowing non-government market providers to offer certain courses. In some circumstances, that's their prerogative. They've been elected by the people of South Australia. They get the opportunity to implement their agenda. The Minister gets the opportunity to put in place his programs. But while the Minister might potentially not go so far as to admit that he is grateful to have come into the stewardship of TAFE SA after 4 Rob Lucas budgets, rather than 4 previous Labor Treasurer budgets, I will nevertheless say on behalf of Rob Lucas to the Minister, you are welcome. Back to the Act. We worked within its imperfections, and we were able to make significant strides supporting TAFE SA alongside a recovering and then increasingly strongly growing non-government sector to serve the interests of South Australian students, job seekers, people who wanted to upskill, and the businesses and industries who so needed those skills in their workforces. But we were not, and we are not, operating in a contestable market. It was never set to be one when TAFE often gets 3 times the funding as a non-government provider offering the same course. All the good intentions, all the best endeavours, and all the clear instructions to work collaboratively with the non-government sector in the world are still going to run into difficulties from time to time. And absent specific instructions from the Minister, the Board's legal duties are, of course, to the organisation under the Corporations Act, ahead of what might be more broadly understood to be the state's interest. So reform is a worthy objective. I commend the Minister for undertaking the reform, as do the Liberal Party, and now is as good a time as any to implement legislation such as this. Let's consider for a moment what form those reforms might take. Different suggestions get put forward from time to time. Some have been pretty significant. Suggestions put to me over the years have included splitting TAFE into a number of separate regional providers. I think the former member, how do we refer to him? The recently relieved member for Mount Gambier had a motion to the House of this sort of nature not so long ago, and that attracted some support from the Labor Party at the time, as I recall. Anyway, that was one suggestion. There was a suggestion, as highlighted, I think, by a bill that was proposed by the Greens before the last election to regularise TAFE SA back within the public service, which would in fact achieve a number of the goals of the proposal being put forward today. It would regularise forever the fact that the staff are public servants and not employed by a separate entity, but of course that's as has happened anyway, so it wouldn't have made much difference there. That had certain attractions and may one day in the future be considered again if this model doesn't work out as we all hope it will. It's also been suggested from time to time that TAFE SA's training provision should be separated from its assessment provision or separated from its infrastructure provision, or various iterations of those have all been suggested. And they reflect different models of reform that have been tried around the country and around the world. Compared with some of those ideas, the actual reform in front of us today to transfer it from a statutory corporation or a government business into a statutory authority is fairly modest. In fact, I note that the Ray report never actually refers to TAFE as a statutory corporation. I did a word search to see exactly where the reference to this bill was, highlighting that it should be changed from a public corporation to a statutory authority. And the only 2 times the word statutory authority are mentioned in the Ray report are when Associate Professor Ray refers to TAFE as a statutory authority. It was potentially the view of the authors of the report that TAFE SA already is a statutory authority, although they then may clarify in the next chapter that it's a government corporation, and they quote from Tom Kenyon's speech, similar quotes to those that I highlighted earlier. The point I make is the difference between a statutory corporation and a statutory authority is not massive, but it is real and it is beneficial. So, the proposal in front of us today may be relatively modest in the scheme of things, but it is entirely logical. It is a good proposal, and we take the view that it is a clear and unambiguous improvement on the current Act. So how did the government come to this proposal? The Minister's announcement in 2023 was contemporary with the release of that report, the long-awaited report from Associate Professor Jeannie Ray with her committee, which included some people from TAFE, some people from unions. There were some industry representatives there. I think Peter Nolan, of great experience in running non-government training organisations, Pierre, amongst others, was on the committee from memory. There were some very good people on that committee, and they no doubt worked very hard. So the Minister's second reading identified the bill responds to the recommendation of Associate Professor Ray that the Act be reformed. And I think in the second reading, the language that he uses makes it clear that he's tried to identify what he considers and the government potentially considers, and what I probably would agree are some of the best aspects of that report. And they have used that to inspire the legislation, and that's fine, and we're considered on its merits. There are some things in the report that were not included in the bill, and that's fine too. But prior to preparing these comments and discussing this bill, it had been a couple of years since I'd read it. So I refreshed my memory, and it begins with the section called The Context. And Ray, or the authors of the report, write, I quote, TAFE SA in 2023 carries a legacy in terms of aspirations and ambitions, not just in public assets and community support. Considering aspects of the history of TAFE helps explain some of the contemporary ambiguities which inform this roadmap. And the subsequent pages set out a history from the 1830s to the present of vocational training. In rereading it, I'd hoped it would present some useful reflection and consideration of the proposals in this bill. I hoped it might reflect on some of the story that I've described, the journey from 2012 through to 2018 and then on to 2023. I was interested in how it would consider the Skills for All debacle, the defunding of the non-government sector, the massive TAFE budget cuts of 2017 in Labor's last year, their last mid-year budget review, and the reputational crisis caused by the ASQA quality scandal, accreditation scandal of the same year. I hope to glean some insights, sir, from Professor Ray's historical account of this tumultuous decade since corporatisation, and I hoped that that would provide the logical analysis that would lead to the bill we're at today. But unfortunately, with all respect, I was surprised that very little of this narrative, or very little reflection even on this period of time, made it into the text. We were able to read about the early 19th century mechanics institutes operating in England prior to South Australia's proclamation. There's a very interesting paragraph on the evolution of the South Australia Institute to the South Australian Institute of Technology between 1856 and 1892. The development of the TAFE systems, national approaches to training over the second half of the 20th century is narrated over the course of about 4 pages. There's positive commentary on Whitlam, there's negative commentary on Fraser, there's positive commentary on Albanese, there's negative commentary about John Howard. So I've got to say, after reading that, I was starting to feel like it was a bit more of a political document than a dispassionate analysis of the context in which the TAFE SA organisation found itself. But thinking back to my time as Shadow Minister in 2018, I was getting towards the end and I was thinking, how will this treat the budget cuts of the Weatherall years, the 2017 quality crisis, which disrupted the lives of thousands of students and staff alike, which was not fully resolved until December 2018, let alone the ongoing impacts to the organisation that lasted a few years thereafter. At least I thought that's what had happened. The report instead only has a brief reference inside a paragraph about decommissioned shonky providers. It offers 2 brief sentences in brackets, and I quote, TAFE SA itself faced reputational damage when ASQA withheld relicensing in 2016. I note it was 2017, not 2016, due to several instances of assessment quality issues. I note for the record it was 16 instances of failed audits, 2 of which were remedied, 4 of which were not attempted to be continued by TAFE, and 10 of which were failed a subsequent audit. Professor Ray goes on to write, which TAFE SA corrected within a few months and passed the audit. Since then, TAFE SA has had its licence rolled over with that issue. I highlight for the record a different set of timeline that the primary sources that I'll go through in a minute bear out differently, but in short, it was December 2018 until all of the students had had their subjects remediated and TAFE SA was able to confirm it could continue offering those courses. It was 2019 before TAFE SA was able to gain reaccreditation again, and we were able to do so for a 7-year reaccreditation, which had never been achieved before. It's the maximum allowed by ASQA. So the fact that TAFE SA since 2019 has managed to make it to next year before it needs to be reaccredited again is a credit to an enormous body of work by all of those public servants I said before, including about half of the 2,000 staff at TAFE SA had a direct involvement in correcting course materials, correcting assessments, or remediating students, or supporting students. There were hundreds of students, sir, who were studying at TAFE who had to redo aspects of their course. There were hundreds of students, sir, who had completed their studies, but who were unable to get their parchments until they had to resit assessments or have coursework redone to correct the errors in the previous training package. And so this is hard to believe, but there were hundreds of students who had received their parchments only to find that those parchments were retrospectively not recognised as a result of the quality audit and then had to come back and do more assessments. I read again from the report. Several instances of assessment quality issues which TAFE SA corrected within a few months and passed the audit. Since then, TAFE SA has had its licence rolled over without issue. Sir, I hope that in 10 or 15 years' time, the Parliament doesn't need to be looking back at TAFE SA legislation with disappointment as we all are now. The dreams of the hoped-for improvements that we had in 2012 having been dashed, we are disappointed, sir. I hope that in 10 or 15 years' time, members of Parliament and people interested in the training sector don't have reason to come back and look at these debates and wonder what happened that led to these circumstances. And I have some confidence that they weren't. I have some confidence and hopes that this bill will see us through and we won't need those further reforms. But if, sir, though people do have cause to look back at those 2025 debates and wonder what was the cause of all those problems, what was the situation prior to the need for this bill to come into place, what happened in 2017, I hope that they will look further than the Ray report when it comes to identifying that historical analysis. And I offer instead an alternative timeline which is checked against primary sources, readily available to anybody who cares to so much as Google them or look in the Parliamentary Library. And coincidentally, given they'll be leaving this place soon, sir, I hope this reflection that will follow potentially this afternoon will also provide some sufficient context for the support given to TAFE SA during the term of the previous government when I had ministerial responsibility for the organisation. It was a privilege then, and I seek leave potentially to continue my remarks after the lunch break.
Oh, you still got another minute.
Another minute, sir?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, in that case, sir, I will, rather than commencing on the dot point analysis, I will foreshadow that dot point analysis, starting with the Skills for All debacle, taking us through the CASA report that saw TAFE's qualifications to deliver air safety programs and mechanical airline engineering programs disqualified, that Parafield Airport was effectively shut by CASA, not by any decision of government, the ASQA quality scandal, the $97 million worth of cuts imposed by Weatherall Labor treasurers imposed on the organisation, the $350 million of restored funding and sustainable funding provided by the former Liberal government to enable this organisation to be on its feet. And now, sir, we're in a position to support the reforms to the bill that will set TAFE SA up to be more in line with government priorities in the years ahead, and hopefully will also enable it to be better in line with the needs of the training sector as a whole, rather than just the industrial needs of the organisation. I seek leave to continue those remarks after lunch.
Leave granted. Leave is granted.